The year was 1588. The fate of Europe hung by a thread as the greatest naval force ever assembled cast dark shadows across the waters of the Atlantic. This is the story of how England faced impossible odds, how nature itself became a weapon of war, and how the course of history turned on the courage of sailors and the winds of fortune. God breathed and they were scattered. These words, etched on a medal commemorating England's victory, tell only part of the tale. The full story involves political intrigue, religious fervor, daring tactics, and a clash of titans that would reshape the world. In the red corner stood Spain, the mightiest empire on earth, ruled by King Philip II, a man whose dominion stretched from the Americas to the Philippines. His armada consisted of 130 ships, carrying 8,000 sailors and 18,000 soldiers. These weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons and filled with battle-hardened veterans. In the blue corner was England, led by Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who had turned a small island nation into a rising maritime power through wit, determination, and no small amount of audacity. Her navy was smaller but faster, commanded by seasoned sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham. But before we witness the clash of these titans, let's roll back the clock to understand why Spain and England, once allies, became bitter enemies. The story begins with Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, who broke from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn. This religious revolution turned England Protestant, while Spain remained staunchly Catholic. Philip II, who had once been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, saw himself as the defender of Catholic Europe. When Elizabeth supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, Philip's patience snapped. The final straw? Elizabeth's support of English privateers, pirates with royal permission who regularly plundered Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas. The most famous of these was Sir Francis Drake, whom the Spanish called El Drake, the Dragon. In 1587, Drake launched a daring raid on the Spanish port of Cádiz, destroying dozens of ships and supplies meant for the Armada. This singeing of the king's beard, as Drake called it, delayed the Spanish invasion by a year but also hardened Philip's resolve. Spring 1588, the Spanish Armada finally set sail from Lisbon. The plan was brilliant in its conception. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, link up with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and transport them across to invade England. The combined army would then march on London, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism to England. The Spanish ships were arranged in a crescent formation that stretched for miles across the sea. This floating city of wood and canvas was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman with little naval experience but impeccable loyalty to Philip. The Spanish strategy relied on their traditional naval tactics: get close to enemy ships, board them, and let their superior soldiers do the fighting. But the English had other ideas. Their ships were smaller but more maneuverable, with better guns and crews trained to fight at a distance. They had no intention of letting the Spanish get close enough for hand-to-hand combat. The first skirmishes took place off Plymouth, where the English harried the Spanish fleet like wolves nipping at the heels of a bear. The Spanish ships, tall and imposing, proved difficult to sink but equally difficult to maneuver in the challenging waters of the English Channel. For a week, the two fleets played a deadly game of cat and mouse up the channel. The English, led by Lord Howard and Drake, picked off stragglers and probed for weaknesses but avoided full-scale battle. This cautious approach frustrated both sides. The Spanish couldn't force a decisive engagement, while the English watched their ammunition dwindle. Then came the Battle of Gravelines, near the French coast. Here, the English unveiled their secret weapon, fireships. In the dead of night, they set 8 ships ablaze and sent them sailing into the tightly packed Spanish formation. Panic erupted among the Spanish ships. The Duke of Medina Sidonia ordered the Armada to cut their anchors and scatter. Better to lose anchors than entire ships. But this decision would have fatal consequences. Without anchors, the Spanish ships were at the mercy of the winds and tides. The next day, the English closed in for their most aggressive attack yet. Their superior gunnery and mobility finally showed its worth. Spanish ships, already disorganized from the fireship attack, took heavy damage. The English guns pounded the Spanish hulls while staying safely out of range of Spanish weapons. But the real destroyer of the Armada was yet to come: the weather. As the scattered Spanish ships tried to regroup, strong winds began pushing them northward. With no anchors and damaged ships, they had no choice but to flee up the North Sea. What followed was one of the most tragic naval retreats in history. The Spanish were forced to take the long way home around Scotland and Ireland. The journey became a nightmare of broken ships, starvation, and drowning. Storms smashed ships against the rocky Irish coast. Local Irish chiefs killed many survivors, either out of loyalty to England or simple opportunism. Of the 130 ships that had set out, only about 65 made it back to Spain. Thousands of sailors and soldiers never saw their homes again. When Philip II heard the news, he reportedly said, "I sent the Armada against men, not God's winds and waves." The defeat of the Spanish Armada changed everything. It marked the beginning of the end for Spanish naval supremacy and the rise of English sea power. Elizabeth's England had stood alone against the mightiest empire in the world and emerged victorious. The psychological impact was enormous. England began to see itself as exceptional, protected by God and the seas. But let's look at some fascinating details that often get overlooked in this epic tale. Take the English fireships, for instance. The idea came from the siege of Antwerp in 1585, where Dutch rebels had used explosive ships against Spanish forces. The English ships at Gravelines weren't actually packed with explosives, they were simply set on fire. But the Spanish, remembering Antwerp, feared they might be explosive and panicked accordingly. Then there's the matter of technology. The English ships used a new gun design that could be reloaded faster than Spanish ones. They also employed the revolutionary, race-built, galleon design, which emphasized speed and maneuverability over size. These technological edges proved crucial in the running battles up the Channel. The weather that scattered the Armada wasn't just bad luck, it was part of a larger climate phenomenon. The 1580s saw several years of unusual weather patterns, possibly related to what historians now call the Little Ice Age. The Spanish never factored this into their planning. Let's talk about the human cost. The Spanish losses were staggering. Around 11,000 men never returned home. Many who survived were changed forever. One Spanish captain wrote in his journal, "We were not defeated by the English. We were defeated by the sea." The English sailors, despite their victory, faced their own hardships. Queen Elizabeth's government was notoriously tight with money, and many sailors went unpaid for their service. Disease killed more English sailors than Spanish guns. The close quarters of ships were perfect breeding grounds for typhus and other illnesses. The aftermath of the Armada shaped European history for centuries to come. England's victory established it as a major naval power and set the stage for the later British Empire. The defeat weakened Spain's grip on the Netherlands, leading eventually to Dutch independence. It also marked a shift in naval warfare. Future battles would be decided by gunfire rather than boarding actions. But perhaps the most interesting legacy is how the story of the Armada grew in the telling. Elizabeth's famous speech at Tilbury, where she declared she had the heart and stomach of a king, became a defining moment of English history. The defeat of the Armada entered national mythology as a defining moment when England stood alone and triumphed against overwhelming odds. The reality, as always, was more complex. England had crucial support from Dutch rebels who blocked Spanish ports in the Netherlands. The weather played a bigger role than English tactical brilliance. And Spain, though wounded, remained a powerful empire for many years to come. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to add new dimensions to our understanding of the Armada. Shipwrecks found off the Irish coast have yielded fascinating artifacts, personal items that humanize the Spanish sailors who met their fate in those cold waters. Clay pipes, leather shoes, and personal religious medals tell stories of the men behind the grand historical narrative. The ships themselves were technological marvels of their time. The Spanish galleons were essentially floating cities, carrying enough food and water for thousands of men for months at sea. They had on board carpenters, blacksmiths, and even priests. The English ships, while smaller, were marvels of engineering in their own right, with innovative hull designs that made them more agile than anything else on the seas. Let's consider the leadership styles that clashed during the campaign. The Spanish command structure was rigid and hierarchical, reflecting their formal military tradition. Orders had to pass through proper channels, leading to delayed decisions. The English, by contrast, allowed their captains more initiative, which proved crucial in the fast-paced channel battles. The story of the Armada also shows how propaganda and information warfare played crucial roles even in the 16th century. Both sides published accounts of the battles, each claiming victory until the final outcome became undeniable. Elizabeth's government was particularly skilled at spinning the victory into a demonstration of divine favor. The weapons and tactics used during the campaign revolutionized naval warfare. The English preferred to attack from a distance using heavy guns, while the Spanish ships were designed for close-quarter combat. This fundamental difference in approach would influence naval design and tactics for centuries to come. Consider the logistics involved in assembling the Armada. Spain spent years gathering supplies, enough food for 30,000 men for 6 months, thousands of guns, countless cannonballs, and sheets of lead to repair hull damage. The coordination required was unprecedented for its time. The communication systems of the period played a crucial role. The English used a chain of beacon fires along the coast to spread news of the Armada's approach. This medieval early warning system proved remarkably effective, allowing English forces to mobilize quickly. The role of espionage shouldn't be overlooked. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had agents throughout Europe who provided crucial intelligence about Spanish preparations. This information allowed England to prepare its defenses and position its forces effectively. The personal stories within this grand historical drama are equally fascinating. Take the story of Pedro de Valdez, commander of the Spanish ship Nuestra Señora del Rosario. When his ship was damaged in a collision, the rest of the Armada left him behind rather than risk the entire fleet. He was captured by Drake, but was treated as an honored guest due to his noble status, a reminder that even in warfare, class distinctions mattered. Or consider the tale of William Hawkins, who commanded the English ship Swallow. During the Battle of Gravelines, his ship ran out of ammunition but continued to fight by firing away all its iron work, including chains and even cooking pots. The defeat of the Armada also had unexpected environmental impacts. The need for ships led to increased deforestation in England as trees were cut down for shipbuilding. This would eventually force England to look to its American colonies for naval supplies. The financial cost of the campaign was staggering for both sides. Spain's attempt to rebuild its fleet nearly bankrupted the treasury, while Elizabeth's government struggled to pay its sailors and maintain its ships. These economic strains would have long-lasting effects on both nations. The medical aspects of the campaign are often overlooked. More men died from disease than from combat. Ships carried primitive medical supplies, and wounds that would be easily treated today were often fatal. The Spanish ships, being larger and more crowded, suffered particularly badly from disease outbreaks. The Armada campaign also marked a crucial point in the development of naval traditions. Many of the signals and protocols used by modern navies trace their origins to this period. The experience gained in these battles helped establish standardized naval practices. The impact on ordinary people in England was significant. Coastal communities lived in fear of Spanish invasion, while inland towns were required to provide men and supplies for the war effort. The victory celebrations that followed were some of the largest public gatherings of the age. The defeat had profound psychological effects on the Spanish Navy. Future Spanish captains became more cautious in their operations, particularly in the English Channel. This hesitancy would influence Spanish naval strategy for generations. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Armada was how it demonstrated the importance of adaptation in warfare. The English victory came not from overwhelming force, but from innovative tactics, superior technology, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As we look back on these events from our modern perspective, we can see how this pivotal moment shaped the world we live in today. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point that influenced politics, religion, technology, and national identity. The story of the Spanish Armada teaches us that the course of history often turns on a combination of preparation, innovation, courage, and simple luck. It shows us how seemingly invincible forces can be defeated by smaller but more adaptable opponents. In the end, the defeat of the Spanish Armada remains one of history's great drama, a tale of hubris and heroism, of technology and tradition, of human courage and nature's power. It's a reminder that even the greatest powers can be humbled, and that the course of history can turn on the changing of the wind. The echoes of 1588 still resound today in the ships that sail the world's oceans, in the navies that guard national interests, and in the stories we tell about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Spanish Armada may have failed in its mission, but it succeeded in writing one of history's most compelling chapters. As the sun sets on our tale, remember that somewhere beneath the waters around Britain and Ireland lie the remains of those mighty Spanish ships, silent witnesses to one of history's greatest naval campaigns. They remind us that every great historical event is, at its heart, a human story, a story of ambition and fear, courage and despair, triumph and tragedy.